Okay, and we're on.
Awesome. Fantastic. Another episode of Highlands to Islands. I'm Cameron George, National Ambassador for Ardbeg, and with me we have Glenn Modan, as always, the National Ambassador for Glenmorangie. Thank you very much for tuning in to another awesome episode. We've got a really fun one in store today. We're joined by an incredible guest, a friend of not only my own, but also the brand of Ardbeg, somebody who has helped this brand immensely over its life, since being resurrected from the ashes, as they say. The one and only Mr. Tim Puett, the creative mastermind who came up with the Ardbeg Project. So thank you for coming on today, Tim.
Oh, thanks for having me. It'd be fun to be here.
Right. So today's conversation is really very, very much so rooted in Islay. That's why I'm going to be doing a lot of the speaking today and kind of questioning. And we've got some inquisitive minds that they're going to be, wanting to know the answers to a lot of different questions. And so I'm going to hope to voice a lot of these questions. I've got some things written down that I wanted to pick your brain about. But first and foremost, let's go ahead and start with an introduction. Where are you from? How did you get the idea for the Ardbeg Project? Like, what is your relationship to Ardbeg as a brand?
Well, I'm from San Jose, California. Born and raised here in California, and didn't get into whiskey until about 2005, I think. I was given a bottle of Ardbeg 10 from my boss, and we opened it that night, and it kind of opened our eyes to the magic of single malt. And I just started kind of dove in. At the time I couldn't really afford a very expensive bottle. So I met some enthusiasts that said there were batch variations among just Ardbeg 10. So I dove in on the bottle codes, and back then through forums on whiskymagazine.com. I just started going around all liquor stores and looking for different bottle codes, and I wanted to compile the information really just for myself. So I started using sheets, and then eventually I figured, well, I could make a website. And then with the help of a lot of people, enthusiasts in the UK and Belgium, Sweden, all over the world, just started feeding me information. So I was really just compiling what other people already knew. And I just started with the website with codes, and then started with, expanded to expressions. And that's really how I got into it.
Yeah. That's actually a really great point to bring up very, very early on, and something that is, not only, helps us to identify bottlings from Ardbeg, but also Glenmorangie as well. So you were one of the first people that I got to kind of hear speak about the bottling codes. And actually, David Blackmore during my onboarding was like, all right, you have to be in touch with Tim. He is kind of like the de facto brand, historian. So what is the bottling code for Ardbeg? How has it evolved? Or I should say Ardbeg and Glenmorangie, and how has it evolved over the last, 15 years that you've seen it and kind of been tracking it?
Yeah, so they used to have a facility in Broxburn, I believe, and that's where their main bottling lines were. They had several lines that, I think it was 3 ml. They called it the almond line. These are all unofficial names that I was given by an informant way back in the day. And 4 ml was traditionally Ardbeg, 5 ml was for miniatures, and then they put a new bottling line in that was a 6 ml. I think it was called the Caledonian. I'm looking at references if you see me looking up. I don't commit all of this to memory. And then they had special, you might see 7 ml or 8 ml for special or odd size bottles, or single casks. Even the Scotch Malt Whisky Society was bottled at these facilities, and you can check up before, I forget the year, but a lot of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottles will have date codes that can be deciphered just like Ardbeg and Glenmorangie.
Nice.
So yeah, it evolved, and then eventually they sold the lines, the 3 ml, 4 ml lines, and now you'll see 6 ml on Ardbeg. I believe, unless I'm getting old, so my memory goes the way of the. Well,
I do.
Yeah.
It's the eyesight for me. I can't see the bottling code on the back now. It's the eyesight. For some, it's the memory. For some, it's the eyesight. So for me, it's the eyesight.
Or both.
You know what?
Yeah.
My memory was going. They took the 6 ml off the bottle back in 2014. So,
and you just pointed out to me that the bottling code on that bottle of Fino back there is dot matrixed on, but now there's laser etch.
So it was 2003 when they went to the etched code, which was, you'll notice some people will say there's no bottle code on my Ardbeg, and that's usually older bottles because that dot matrix can be rubbed off on some of them.
Got it.
I haven't been able to rub one off. That's bad. Not really the right term.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I haven't been able to erase a code from a bottle. But the other thing is sometimes there had to be some spoilage or label problems or something where they, maybe they replaced the bottle or had the end of a bin to fill. So they could have filled bottles without bottle codes. But there's nothing official that explains that. But yeah, 2003 they changed to the etched code, and I think 2008 or 9 they modified the etched design. But I can't get anything official because, as you mentioned earlier, I never answered what my relationship with Ardbeg and Glenmorangie is, and it's really just I'm an enthusiast that got lucky to be able to talk to a lot of people that work there. Absolutely. So I get random bits of information, nothing proprietary because I'm not under NDA, so I can't get anything really secretive.
Right.
But everyone's been great. David Blackmore since way back in the day. So,
so something that immediately starts to kind of, become a question for me is like, well, you have this immense love of Ardbeg. Did that lead you to a path of discovering a little bit more about Islay as a place as well? Because that's what our episode today is really about, is not only the history of Ardbeg brand, but also how that coincides with some of the history of the island as well. So you've been to Islay many, many different times, so have you become a fan and a lover of the island as well?
Oh yeah. Some people say you can't stay on an island for too long when you visit, you get island fever, or I even surprisingly felt that in Hawaii. It's kind of like there's nowhere else to go. Let me get out of here. But when I've gone to Islay, I stayed there a week and I wasn't in a hurry to leave. It's a great island. The people are nice. Wave to everybody when you drive. Other distilleries, it's not like a competition among distilleries. At least that's not the feel I got. You go to one distillery and somebody just is worked at Ardbeg the previous year, or vice versa. So it really seems like a family atmosphere on Islay.
And I think that is, it's very funny that you mention, the word family, because in my notes for today's episode, there is one in particular. There's a series of families that I think have contributed to whiskey development on Islay. Obviously, the McDougals and Clan McDougall with Ardbeg, but really even the Campbell family. So are you aware and familiar with the Campbells and their contributions to the island?
On a surface level, yes, but probably not anywhere near what you've been researched for this. I'd be interested to hear this stuff too.
Yeah, so for me, that was kind of the genesis point when I think about Islay becoming, as Dan, as you pointed out earlier in the pre-show, when you started thinking about Islay becoming like Whiskey Island, I think that really does start with Daniel Campbell, who founded the town of Bowmore in the 1760s. Obviously, Bowmore now is synonymous with one of the most iconic whiskey distilleries in the world, the Bowmore. Which became a licensed distillery in 1779, far before any other distillery on the island. And it was very much so thanks to to the Campbell family that you saw whiskey on the island take this meteoric kind of rise. Bowmore predates the first exciseman on Islay as well, which didn't happen until 1796, 1797, around there.
Yeah. What's interesting about Daniel Campbell, we've talked about this on a number of Whiskey and Taxes presentations. Oh, by the way, our friend Wendy in Chicago would like to, Tim, she would like to be your librarian to archive all your information. So she has volunteered to be the Ardbeg Project librarian. So
Oh,
you've got
very
that going
cool.
for you, which is nice. She's awesome.
All right.
So Daniel Campbell, the fella that, as Cam pointed out, built the town of Beaumont, he was the irony behind Daniel Campbell was that he was a member of Parliament, and this would have been in the era of 1725 when the first significant malt tax was levied. There was a malt tax in England long before to help pay for the English Civil Wars, but the agreement was that it wouldn't be applied to Scotland until after the War of Spanish Succession. So it was attempted in 1713, and that didn't go well. Attempted again in 1725. So Daniel Campbell was a member of the House of Parliament, and he lived in Glasgow, in this house in Glasgow. He's a member of Parliament, voted for the malt tax. And during the riots, the rioters showed up and burned his house to the ground because they knew that he'd voted for the malt tax. So he applied for compensation and was granted compensation to the tune of 9,000 British pounds at that point. Used the money to buy Islay. So the entry into Islay from the Campbell family came through the Glasgow malt tax riots, which is, I think, really interesting.
That is super intriguing. I actually had never heard that part of the story as well. That's very, very funny.
Oh, that was the grandfather. So that was the Daniel Campbell that was the grandfather of the grandson Daniel Campbell that built the town of Beaumont. So the grandson had a lot to do with trying to develop Islay's economy, connecting it to the mainland, and bringing its economy into a more thriving ecosystem, a sort of broader ecosystem. But that's sort of the entry point for the Campbell clan into Islay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, wow. And it's the Campbell clan is responsible for so much development. I mean, the first commercial or the first steamliner to run to Islay was the byproduct of the Campbells and well. So really, when we're looking at Islay becoming Whiskey Island, I really do think it is very much so thanks to them. The Mundell family now, which does all the trucking on Islay, is also an incredibly important family. Shout out to Johnny. Hopefully we'll get him on the show sometime sooner or later as well.
That'd be awesome.
But from an Ardbeg perspective, life at Ardbeg, or as the distillery that we know, started in 1815. But am I correct in believing that there was illegal or illicit distillation happening at Ardbeg or at Arnhem Based long before they got the license to become a distillery?
Well, I think from assumptions about all the legal distilleries probably being illegal before they got the license, I would agree. It's just difficult to prove a time because from what I was told about historical records, there's really no reference from this, the kind of the infamous 1794 date that you've heard, or you see on some of these old, I call them fakes, although I don't want to offend people that maybe paid a lot of money for them. There's nothing proven of dates, but yes, there had to have been illicit distilling in those areas before, because they really were trying to help people to become legal to pay tax back then, if I recall my reading correctly.
Right. The first recorded date of the MacDougall clan being tenant farmers of Walter Campbell, the Campbell that owned the Kildalton area at the time, 1798. Just to give some sense of context there. But to Cam's point, I think there are records of alcohol being produced in some form, either fermented or distilled, back to the early 18th century, the 1700s, the early 1700s.
And they definitely would have had to have some practice before they got their license in 1815. So
right, exactly. Well, and the really fascinating bit about all that, so the Lords of the Isles settled the area and were the first sort of form of like significant governance. But the historical families that were the physicians of the Lords of the Isles, two families one of them, and I was just looking at my notes, the Beatons. So the Beatons hung out, were colonized, were really part of the Skye infrastructure, and the Macbeths. So the actual Macbeths of Shakespeare fame were the apothecaries of the Lords of the Isles, and whiskey, because the Lords of the Isles, the seat of power was Islay, and the Macbeths were the apothecaries for the Lords of the Isles. Whiskey was medicine back then anyway, so that would have naturally been a place where whiskey as medicine would have been. The process would have been refined and focused. So it goes to as far as I can tell, it goes back to the relationship between the Macbeths and the Beatons and the Lords of the Isles and whiskey as medicine, and their roles as the doctors to the Lords of the Isles.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's also a fair assumption to assume that there was a lot of distillation happening on Islay, at around this time period, because if you move into the future, getting into into the 1850s and so on, Islay had already had about 26 commercial distilleries, and by the mid 1850s, it was down to about 16, right? So, I mean, that allows us to make the assumption that there were a lot of very accomplished and practiced distillers that had been inhabiting and working on Islay for quite some time already.
Yeah.
The way that you'd mentioned, Tim, the evolution of excise tax and malt tax. The timing, 1814 and 1814, 1816, 1823 are three significant dates that really sort of governed the evolution of legal distilling on Islay and then around the country. So the malt tax was instituted in 1725, but by 1814, all stills under 2,000 gallons were declared illegal. So there was an emphasis on creating legal distillation for the larger producers on Islay. It didn't really work out so well, but you do see 1814, 1815 as a significant date on Islay. By 1816, the Small Stills Act was passed, and that made stills over 40 gallons legal temporarily, but they hadn't really solved the excise, the distilling, the still licensure fees. That didn't happen until 1823 when the Excise Act was passed, and you could get a license for 10 British pounds, but you had to distill with a still capacity of over 4,000 gallons. So that was when the push towards significant moving away from crofters and rural, same thing that happened in the U.S., moving away from an agrarian economy to a more industrial economy, favoring larger producers, dropping the licensure rate to make it possible for more people to become legal, but then focusing on, okay, if you're going to do this, do it legitimately and to scale. So that's how that whole number of whatever it was, 1725, 1814, 1816, and 1823. That's how they're all connected.
Yeah, I was going to say that would be the next date would be 1823. So I guess the Excise Act of 1823, what did that do for the whiskey world in Scotland as we kind of know it, by breaking up some of the larger monopoly that some of the lowland distilleries had, and what effect would that have also had on some of Islay as well?
The only thing that I can tell you is from a Highland perspective, there were the Duke of Gordon. Duke of Gordon was the one that went to Parliament and introduced what would be the legislation that would become the Excise Act, because he had, just like what was going on with the Campbells on Islay, there were loads of folks distilling and loads of lairds who were being paid basically under the table from illegal distillate. But the Duke of Gordon went back and said, okay, we need to legitimize this. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that Small Stills Act where all the small stills are legal, but the taxation rate is really high. And we're going to make the licensure rate really low, but the stills have to be of a certain size. So for 1814 to 1816, small stills were okay, then they weren't. And then they weren't, and then they were, but then by 1823 they weren't again, but the licensure rate had dropped. So all the Duke of Gordon's tenants had the opportunity, and this is the Brazier Glenlivet Valley, had the opportunity to go legit. Most of them didn't want to, but he sort of forced the Glenlivet to become the first legal distillery in the Brazier Glenlivet on his land, on the Duke of Gordon's land, by saying, you're going to go legit or I'm going to kick you out. Then he bought him guns so he could defend himself against all the illegal distillers that didn't want to go legit. On Islay, I think it was sort of the same pressure in terms of, now there's an excise guy here, and the licensure issue, the rate of taxation. I think the biggest thing about 1823 was the dropping of the rate, and the rate of taxation became such that you could actually turn a profit, still pay your landlord, sell your product, and keep the distillery running without having to be underground to do so. So it was an adjustment of the rate of excise tax, an adjustment of the price of licensure. That was the two biggest deals that really colonized the legitimate whiskey producing community around Scotland.
Absolutely. And so, because as a residual effect of the 1823, Excise Act, you would have seen, a sweeping kind of spur of Islay distilleries starting to open. Ones that come to mind from notes are, Losset, Mullindry, Glenavullin, Port Ellen, and Lockendall as well. All
nice.
would have, come online after that 1823 Excise Act. So I think that was important, not only for the Highlands, but for the greater whiskey world as far as Scotch is concerned at the same time.
Right.
So Tim, I guess another question that I have for you is, what do you think is kind of the heyday for Ardbeg? What do you think is its greatest, its greatest time period? Because Ardbeg is a brand that has gone on a roller coaster ride. We use that term, often, from being the largest distillery on Islay by 1835 to, almost having to shut its doors in the 1850s. What do you think are some of the greatest days for Ardbeg as a distillery?
That is kind of tough. But in my view, one of the greatest times was around 1835 when Thomas Buchanan decided to invest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the Buchanan and Wilson stayed as agents and principal investors until I believe it was, I have it here.
I want to say it was 1959. I want to say was when the whole thing was liquidated.
Yeah. It was late December 10th, 58.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Ardbeg Distillery Limited was incorporated, and that's when it officially changed. But I mean, you're talking, I think personally, if Buchanan and Wilson hadn't jumped in with Ardbeg back then, I may not have met you guys. So
Right.
I may not be drinking whiskey.
and the Buchanans, Thomas Buchanan was from Glasgow area, if I'm correct in that.
Yeah.
So he was not native to Islay. Interesting how the history of Islay is, and the history of a lot of the brands on Islay is shaped by people who aren't originally necessarily from there. I think that's very interesting. So the Buchanans would have been a part of a part of the distillery and a part of the brand, even as the business changed its name, to the Alexander McDougall Company in the 1830s as well. They would have still been primary investors in the company, is what you're saying.
Yeah, from approximately 1835 until 1950, almost 1959, they were a part of the distillery and principal agents.
Wow. Yeah. Do you have any, Dan? Do you have any insights onto other distilleries or projects that the Buchanan clan might have been a part of?
Ooh, the only relationship that I'm aware, like the enduring relationship that I'm aware of, is Dalwhinnie, I believe, in terms of being Buchanan's as a blend. Dalwhinnie being one of the core constituent elements of Buchanan's as a blend. But that's it as far as that goes. And you'd mentioned the Hayes, Colin Hayes, Senior, Colin Hayes Jr. What I figured out over the course of researching this was it's really interesting. So Alexander McDougall was never really involved. It was a namesake only because he was the final McDougall. He was quite ill. He was a fairly sickly dude, and so the Campbells actually had recruited their coachman. Colin Hay was the coachman for the Campbell Laird, and they recruited him to come and run Ardbeg because Alexander McDougall was too sick to take over. So father and son, the Colin Hayes father and son, that was their entry into running, and then eventually owning a chunk of what Ardbeg became, which I think is really cool.
Really, really cool. And now we have a Colin back at the helm.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
Not a Hay, but he's definitely still a Colin. No. Colin Gordon, the new distillery manager at Ardbeg. We're very excited to see him. Have you gotten to meet Colin, Tim? I'm wondering if you might have gotten to meet him at the maltings or anything like that before.
No, not yet. I may have met him. I don't. I went to Lagavulin plenty of times. I'm sure he probably remembers me just as much as I may remember him. But no, I'm looking forward to when we could travel again, getting over there and meeting the new man at the helm.
He's a terrific guy. You'll really like him.
So with that, I guess that brings us into something that's very interesting. The coveted position of distillery manager at Ardbeg. I feel like Mickey has done, an incredible job for the brand. He is very much so the true Ardbegian. I think that he's one of the most storied distillery managers that Ardbeg has had. Who are some of the other distillery managers that have graced Ardbeg with their presence?
Well, of course, Stuart Thompson before Mickey, and I think a lot of the enthusiasts were really excited to see Stuart Thompson because of the warehouse tours back then. Rules were more laxed, and stories of casks opening and things like that. But so Stuart, and he was the first one in my time knowing Ardbeg. Colin Hay.
Certainly.
It would be fun to try to make a timeline of distillery managers from the beginning to the end. It's on my to-do list. And I'm sure there will be time. But Hamish Scott.
Yep.
He was.
I think that's an important one. That's a very, very important one. Hamish Scott.
Yeah. I got to meet him in 2011. We stayed my first visit to Scotland, or to Islay. I wanted to stay at the bed and breakfast him and his wife had. So I got to have a short conversation with him. But yeah, he going through the historical documents that I was able to see at the archive. I mean, he was very involved in moving Ardbeg from just a, in my opinion, kind of an unknown entity to how much he pushed it in the 70s for people to buy it because of its higher quality. It was a little more expensive, but the quality was much better. At the time, they were bottling it at a little higher ABV than the rest, although it was degrees proof back then. Yeah. So, and not until Allied came in, just shortly before Allied took over Hiram Walker, I'm sorry. Shortly before they took over, they moved it from 80 degrees proof to 70 degrees proof. So back down to the lower strength.
Oh, wow. I wasn't aware of that.
In fact, I've made a timeline of the different bottle releases that were available in the 70s, that old white label that said Old Islay Malt. Mm-hmm. There was a very brief black label with white letters, and then on to the more iconic black label with gold letters that you see from the late 70s up until the 90s before Ardbeg was sold. You'll see it on the very old 30, that same similar type of label.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very important because my understanding of Hamish's kind of mental where he was mentally was that he was slightly unhappy with some of the direction that the brand was being pushed. That some of the asks for ways that he wanted to update and modify the distillery were essentially being cut out at the knees, that he wasn't allowed to do a lot of these things that he thought would allow him to make genuinely just better whiskey.
Some of the tone in the letters sent, although they had to be professional, you could see the undertones of unhappiness he had about the changing the process will drastically change the whiskey. And but when you're fighting with a big organization that comes in, not just exclusively to Ardbeg, but any big organization that comes in and tries to cut costs and streamline procedures. Yeah, Hamish had an uphill battle as soon as Hiram Walker came in, at least from what I've read.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Another famous duo that I feel like we just skipped over, I would have to say would be the sisters, Margaret and Flora. Do you have any thoughts on their contributions to Ardbeg? They were the ones who I believe were controlling partners at Ardbeg when Colin stepped in as distillery manager.
Yeah, I think Margaret handed over. I don't have a lot of information, just some of the tidbits I've gleaned from histories. Handing over management in 1850. I would assume that Margaret and Flora could have just said, "Hey, let's just sell this thing and get out of this." Mm-hmm. But it seems like they did have some forethought, a look into the future of something that they wanted to continue to pass on. And because Dan mentioned earlier, finding, the son of a coachman, right. They must have known him personally to feel, or the recommendation say, okay, he can do this. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think they're really unsung in their drive to continue the distillery in some type of familial or a close relationship.
Absolutely. Because like as Dan had mentioned, Alexander was quite a sickly fellow. And so he was not always up to running task of the distillery. So day-to-day operations and really partnership of the distillery was spearheaded by Margaret and Flora, as well as the Buchanans, it would have been Thomas Gray Buchanan at that time point, who then brought in Colin Gray. I think that's super interesting. Very interesting how Ardbeg has so many different ties between the McDougall family, the Buchanan family, as well as the Campbells, all at the exact same time. Mm-hmm. Islay is, this small island with, now today 3,000 people on it. I'd assume that back then it would have been more densely populated. Am I correct in that assumption as well?
Oh yeah, there. I have in some notes. In 1853, Colin Hayes said approximately 200 people were living around Ardbeg and Lagavulin. So,
yeah, isn't that crazy? And the output by then, by the time Alfred Barnard's book, the output was more until the distillery renovation and expansion comes online. The output then was higher than it is in modern times. So the Hayes really took it from not necessarily a backwater, but to obviously the highest producing distillery on Islay by the end of the 19th century. And what was it? 200 people living there, 40 odd buildings. It'd be cool. Cam, we've been there a bunch. Tim, you've been there. It'd be cool to see the physical layout of the village of Ardbeg then, with all the buildings and the post, the postal service and all that stuff, compared to what it is now. You see some of those pictures where there's big buildings and so on and so forth, and it's like, that's not there, that's not there, that's not there. Yeah. But it's at its full strength. It'd be really interesting to see the layout, how it worked, what 200 people were doing at any given point on a average day in the late 1800s at Ardbeg. It'd be really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll have to share a picture with you. So there was a picture from the archives. It's not that old, but it's from the 70s, I believe. And it still shows the manager's building on the sea.
Yeah, the big one on the coast, yeah.
And
to the left, to the south of the main distillery buildings.
Right. And I was I took a picture when I was there in 2017, I believe. And it just happened to be from almost the same angle, and you could see a
Nice.
jutting rock coming out. And then I added to that a picture from, I think, 2000 and a modern one. So I put them kind of all together. You can see
Nice.
the horizon and how they've changed. So it gives you a little picture. But yeah, pictures from the, the 1850s, or well, whenever they had pictures that were available. I'm sure there are some out there. It's just a matter of finding them and, somebody's possessions or.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it would be great to see all of that and compare it.
Yep.
Dan, I'm wondering if you have any insights as to why, Islay single malts are revered as some of the greatest single malt Scotch whiskies on the planet, but a lot of them historically were used for blending. And I'm wondering if you have any insights as to why blenders, especially blenders from Glasgow, like James Fleming, would have been so into using Ardbeg as well as other distilleries on Islay as key components in their blended whiskeys.
Yeah, so the idea behind peated whiskeys as elements of blends, I think all of the blenders, well, not all of them, but the bulk of the blenders, and the peated whiskey makers whose fortunes became inexorably linked to the success of the blenders, those were, you didn't need much of them, but what they added to the core flavor profile of any given blend was a sort of, to me, yes, physically a certain amount of depth, a richness across the palate, intrigue. But I think the Islay whiskeys, I think the peated whiskeys in any blend lend a certain flavor of place. And we talk about that all the time, about how places like Ardbeg, Bunnahabhain, Old Pulteney, Clynelish, most of or maybe even all the distillers in Scotland are liquid versions of the flavor of the place in which they are located. But I don't think you could make a strong argument that there are whiskeys that are more subconsciously linked to a sense of place than peated Scottish whiskeys. So if those are going to be dialed into blends, I think that peated whiskeys became the cultural touchstone and link for blends to their country of origin. So for me, that's sort of why the peated whiskey makers faced a certain stability and inherent instability, because blenders didn't necessarily need loads and loads and loads of their product, because it didn't take much to make those kinds of changes in the overall blend's flavor structure. But those distilleries were the only ones really doing that effectively and well. So it's sort of, even though they lived in a certain amount of peril, because honestly, the consumption of blended Scotch whiskey has gone through ebbs and flows, and ever since the column still, Robert Stein and Aeneas Coffey came together, and not together, but created what became the modern column still. That changed how whiskey was produced in Scotland in such a way that everybody producing malted barley whiskeys became sort of not puppets of, but under the control of the blenders. And if the blenders needed them, they succeeded. If the blenders didn't need them, they didn't succeed, which wouldn't have been the case when Scottish whiskey production was a more crofters, agrarian. You sell the whiskey to the people within a 5, 10, 20-mile radius of the distillery that you've created out of a thing no taller than a person or whatever. So to me, I think, to answer the question, I think it's the most obvious organoleptic link to a sense of place that a blender can dial in to a blended Scotch whiskey. And that's still to this day, but I think it's historically been the case across the board.
Absolutely. And I think you'd hit the nail that I was hoping that you would hit exactly on the head. And I love you for it. That blended whiskey producers, blended whiskey has ebbed and flowed. And you look at like in 1879, when Ardbeg was really kind of at the height of being used in blends. These blends were being sold all over the world. New markets like Australia, South Africa, started to emerge and consume Scottish whiskey. It wasn't single malt, but it was still blended Scottish whiskey. Some of it obviously being Ardbeg, and then a mere 102 years later, you have Ardbeg having to shut its doors. Because
Yep. To your point, when Ardbeg came out of the mothball of the 80s, the only reason it didn't become a parking lot was because of Ballantines and Teachers. So, I mean, the only reason they kept distilling there and that it survived to the point of being sold to Glenmorangie PLC was to fulfill blending contracts. And to their credit, Allied / Hiram Walker, when that bid from Glenmo PLC came through, it wasn't the highest bid. So as much as Allied and Hiram Walker, you kind of look at that relationship and go, the sorts of restrictions and efficiencies and so on and so forth that were applied on the distillery were debilitating. They at least had the foresight to want to put it into the rightest hands that they could. But it was the blends. If say Glenmo PLC gets credit for being the savior of Ardbeg, but it was the blends. If it hadn't been for the blends, it would have been a parking lot before anybody could have bid on it.
Yeah, and you can, as much as say throwback enthusiasts want to complain about, getting rid of the floor maltings and the horrible things that Hiram Walker Allied may have done.
Yeah.
They were the ones that had kept it going, and really give a lot of credit.
Yeah, to your point.
Look for old Ballantines bottled in the 70s if you want to see if you can get a taste of 30-year-old Ardbeg from. Those are. I shouldn't say this on TV. Those are the ones that you really want to look for if you want to try to taste old Ardbeg.
Right.
Absolutely. So I guess that brings me to another really important question for you, Tim. Is of some of the more iconic blends that Ardbeg has been a part of, what are some of the premier and most iconic ones that come to mind for you?
Ballantines 30 and Ballantines 17-year-old from bottled even in the late 70s or early 80s. But if you could find Ballantines 30 that bottled in the 60s, you're really tasting 1930s Ardbeg.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super quick aside, where were the grain whiskeys coming from? Do you have any idea where their grain whiskeys were being sourced for Ballantines at that point?
This is bad for me to say, but I never really looked into it because I heard the word Ardbeg and I
done. And it was obviously in a high enough percentage in the blend that it's distinct on the palate. So I just wondered if you'd had some insights in terms of where the grain was being sourced from.
Yeah,
grain whiskeys.
Tunnel vision when it comes to Ardbeg.
Yeah, that's all. That is okay.
Cam, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw one question out to Tim just because I'm dying to hear his perspective on it. This goes back obviously deeper than the advent of Ardbeg, in particular. But why Islay? It's not the only island. It wasn't even the only island producing whiskeys. So throughout the Hebrides, from Orkney clear down to Islay, why did Islay survive when the whiskey distilling fortunes of Orkney and Jura and Mull and so on and so forth did not fare as well?
That's the $100,000 question, maybe. It could be. It could have a lot to do with John Ramsay. Back in the 1800s, he did a lot to promote Islay whiskey. He was actually one of the main agents importing or helping to import Port Ellen and Ardbeg into the U.S. in the late 1800s. So there's a book.
There you go.
There's a book about John Ramsay that's a must read for any Islay whiskey historian or aficionado. It really covers a lot about his life. I don't know if you guys know. Did you know there's an Ardbeg in Canada?
Oh yeah, I did know that.
Yeah, if you look up in the Ardbeg area, there's also a small town of McDougall. He was
nice.
Yeah, he was responsible for helping push a migration of Islay citizens to Canada because when they were losing opportunity to make income, he helped move a lot of them to Canada. So you'll see the reference in names up there, and I think it's Ontario.
Does that equate to, and this is just me not knowing date-wise, well, how these things line up, but no, it wouldn't have, because that would have been the Highlands. Never mind. Like the lairds, the landholders around Scotland, bouncing their crofter, their tenant farmers out to maximize, to take the control of the lands over for themselves. Was it tenant farmers that were being displaced at that point that were moving to Canada? Was that where you were going with that?
I don't have the details with me. I believe it started in the 1850s and 1860s. But yeah, I couldn't say for sure which if it was tenant farmers or
right. John Ramsey. That's another really important person as well in terms of Isla's history. So John Ramsey was the title holder at that point for the Kildalton area on Islay in the 1880s, and Ardbeg, Colin Hay, and Alexander Buchanan would have re-signed a lease with John Ramsey actually around that time, because he would have actually owned. And he also, I believe, was the license holder at that time for Port Ellen Distillery. I want to say at the same time. Yeah.
Which was why, as a laird, he was sympathetic to distillers, because he was not only a landholder but a distiller.
But a distiller at the same time. Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So John Ramsey is definitely one of the principal figures of Islay whiskey back in the 1800s.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'll send you a link to, or at least the title of that book. Although,
if you would, that'd be great.
With Google, that'd be fantastic. One main John Ramsey book from that time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, speaking of Islay books, I didn't discover until last night that the current version of Andrew Jefford's book, Peat, Smoke, and Spirit, is called Whiskey Island. So the most recent edition has a foreword by Dave Broom. Mm-hmm. And it's the same book that was written in 2005, but Dave's foreword is amazing. And if you're looking for an in-depth dig into what makes Islay, that Andrew Jefford's book is absolutely stunning. Yeah, it's just so it's well written in the first place, but the depth of research and the points of contextual reference that tie its ancient history to date, the geology, the point about Islay just had more arable land. Harris is not a great place to farm. Islay just happens to have more arable land, so more crofters, more distilling happening. That part, it certainly makes a lot of sense. But it was the Jefford's book that kind of brought that to light for me. And speaking of points of reference, Tim, I'd mentioned to you before the show, I was doing some deep dives into Glenmorangie history, and people might think that the Ardbeg Project is all about Ardbeg. Dig a little deeper, and you will find things like the original website from Glenmorangie. So thank you for preserving those kinds of things, because I found some. We used to, back in those days, Glenmorangie as a function of being family owned, put that kind of information out there into the cybersphere. Some really, really in-depth family histories and lineage of the distillery and the lineage of whiskey making in that part of the country. Not just steam coils were introduced in this year, but why and what were the technical innovations behind it. I wouldn't have found any of that stuff if it hadn't been for your site. So thank you for what you do for Ardbeg is an invaluable resource. I mean, when I started, David told me the same thing. You want to know anything about Ardbeg? You got to talk to Tim, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm thanks. I always try to make sure I give credit where it's appropriate as well. And if it wasn't for all the enthusiasts that I met, like Gordon Homer was a big Ardbeg guy back in the 2000s. He shared a lot of information with me. Geert Bureau is a huge Ardbeg collector. Ian Russell was the Brad's Heritage Manager.
Archivist, yeah.
Yeah, it's, like I said, it's a compilation of things. There's a lot of things I've done on my own, but yeah, the Ardbeg information has been like a group effort by all of the Ardbeg fans.
We've just received a request from my good friend Mike in Omaha to post a link to your website. So that is www.theardbeg project or Ardbeg project?
Just Ardbeg Project.
Okay.
While we're getting that link up, I think you can't mention Islay and the contributions of Islay whiskeys to the whiskey universe without at least having a conversation about DCL. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on the Distillers Company Limited were and their contributions to Islay by amassing so many different distilleries, by helping to lay down the roots and the rubric for distilleries like Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain as well as the other distilleries that they subsequently purchased.
I refer back to a lot of references to whiskey enthusiasts or old school people. The complaint is always something the distillery doesn't do for you or the ownership doesn't do for you. But without them, we wouldn't have what we do. They complain about now Diageo make all the old whiskey goes into Johnny Walker Blue. That's so horrible. But really, all that whiskey is saved. They've been keeping whiskey for us, and DCL was the predecessor to what we now know as Diageo. I initially had maybe minor ill feelings because you want things the way you want them, but single malt really only exists because of blends. And amassing the distilleries you want to make your own blends keeps those distilleries running. So I'm all for DCL / Diageo. Big companies keeping distilleries alive is only a good thing. And if they decide to get rid of a distillery and sell it to a small company or an individual, then hey, now you have a distillery that maybe you can have more input or more contact with the people that make the decisions.
Speaking of that, do you have insights on how the Rosebank deal went down? I mean, is that basically what happened? That Rosebank was sold to a group of investors, or how did that work?
If it's for me, I just know what's been in the news. Yeah, like you said, just getting rid of something to investors that actually want to
want to do a thing with it. Exactly.
And develop it for the land.
Right.
So, yeah, that's and I also think it probably comes down to like in that case, Diageo thinking, do we want to invest in recreating Rosebank as a distillery, or are we willing to sell it to whatever the people want to do with it, whether it's real estate or bringing the distillery back, and they decided to do that to Portela themselves. So,
and Brewer, I mean, so they've got their hands full resurrecting a couple of iconic distilleries as it stands, and Rosebank being, they've already got an iconic lowland distillery in Glenmorangie. Granted, the Rosebank is going to be a whole different ballgame, but I can see their point in terms of this should be in the hands of somebody who's got a vision for it, and they've got their hands full with Portela and with the Brewer renovation.
And I think, to the same point at how they treated Ardbeg, or how Ardbeg was treated, and not necessarily going to the highest bidder, but going to the people with the most vision for the distillery. I think that there's something to be said about a company and about companies that will treat, distilleries that may not be functioning with such regard, intact, and care, even while they're removing them or selling them off from being a part of their family. I think that's incredibly important, and that companies like that have to be commended. I mean, I think that DCL got a lot of flack at the time, around the turn of the century, because the palette for whiskeys that blenders were using around that time had now started to shift away from being, all right, we are looking for Islay whiskeys. Now the palette they were looking for was more subtle, generally Highland in style, single malt Scotch whiskeys that were going into a lot of these blends. And as a byproduct of that, DCL found themselves with quite a few distilleries on Islay that were no longer needed for production of whiskey that was going into blends. But instead of demolishing all of them, at the same time, they kept a lot of them in at least decent shape to be sold off to other companies with a vision for it.
Tim, I've got a follow-up question for you as well. In terms of Islay's future, Islay's not a big place. Obviously, it's if there is such a thing as less than zero unemployment, it exists there. As everybody's got at least one job. Tourism industry is obviously contributing massively to Islay's economy, but Islay is suffering to a degree in terms of infrastructure. It's laboring under the weight of its sustained intrigue as Whiskey Island. What do you think? What do you think the future holds for Islay in terms of can it maintain its position, its lofty position as sort of whiskey mecca, without losing itself to the economics of that?
Yeah, that's quite a question to tackle. I think it can, provided there's some type of, you obviously have to top out in what you're doing for whiskey, as opposed to, you can't make it so that 100% of everything on the island is whiskey related, can you? I guess with Islay you can say that, but I had heard some grumblings in the past that the island wanted more of the funds from the taxation of whiskey to go back to Islay.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think one of the keys for Islay to survive and to not have some type of fallout and not be able to handle this expansion and still keep its identity is to get more of those funds, for infrastructure, for maybe historical programs that can be sponsored. So they could, I know they were putting signs up that had Gaelic and, the English and the Gaelic version, keep some of the history. And I think those can only survive with funding.
Yep.
Only so much work volunteers can do.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. I mean, Islay is the land of a million committees as well, and that pro bono work can only go so far. So I do think that there is a responsibility, of Scotland to be able to assure that Islay is able to be self-sustaining by giving them access to more of those funds. I agree.
It's a very good point that there's that sense that Islay's being the life force is being bled dry, and that there's not enough capital reinvestment in the economic engine that is Islay, and with more lorries and more tourists and the roads sort of falling apart, the societal infrastructure bearing the weight of so many tourists without a lot of reinvestment from the UK government. It's to your point, without an acknowledgement of that, and without a rerouting of that capital, I think it does represent a certain peril for the future of Islay. I don't think demand is going anywhere in terms of the demand for its iconic whiskeys. Clearly, there are 9 distilleries now. Gartbrecht's online. There's another one, being planned. We can talk at another point about how many distilleries is too many for an island, just 25 miles. But the interest is there. The consumer interest is there. The revenue is there. Is it being reinvested in a positive way? And to Diageo's credit, I know that those guys, Cam, you'd mentioned DCL, which became Diageo. Those guys do get they catch a lot of flack for a lot of reasons. Some of those reasons are deserved, but their reinvestment in Kalila, their commitment to sustainability, their commitment to diversity in their workforce. They do some things that I think are quite good and can be the material assets for the long-term survival of Islay as a whiskey producing region and as a region that supports human beings as well.
Yeah, look no further than their work with the maltings to support that as well. The Port Ellen malting facility. That's totally a great call out. Sorry about that, Tim. You were saying.
I didn't want to get too down on say investment not going back into Islay, because I know that, like you said, Diageo, the reinvestment in the distilleries to make them more modern, provides jobs. They do all the owners of distilleries on Islay do a great job of providing a workforce, way to make an income. And I don't ever want to discount the positive things they do, but as we all know, we tend to focus on the complaints we have rather than the compliments we want to give.
Well, and I think your point was more how much tax revenue was being extracted versus being reinvested.
Yeah, I think
that's a real problem.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to remind myself I probably tend to complain about things I don't like a lot more than I compliment those that do things for me. So
well, and I think that's a reasonable and fair thing. You could make as many arguments for what Diageo has done to homogenize the tourist experience, or what they've done to homogenize certain elements of the whiskey experience, and so on and so forth. But so that sword has two edges for sure. But yeah, I mean, to the collective point, there is some good that comes from it, and some sustainability elements and efforts that are, and what they're doing at Rose Isle in terms of sharing the research and findings from Rose Isle. They're doing some good stuff. But to your original point, excise taxation and the way that's redistributed, or the way that those funds are being allocated, is not necessarily in Islay's favor, and I think that's how you slowly starve the engine that you're relying on.
Yeah. Absolutely. And another point that can kind of be taken away from this conversation as well is that whiskey is a way of life on Islay, but it is not the totality of life on Islay. There are other things and there are other interests on Islay that I've fallen in love with. I mean, hanging out at and getting to see the textile, like getting to see the woolen mill, the textile factory on Islay is absolutely incredible. If there is not an investment back into these communities, then we're going to lose things like that. So, what are some of the things outside of whiskey that you've fallen in love with Islay for as well, Tim?
I think that just the overall appreciation of the landscape, the nature that you have out there. I went over to Jura and saw that. So, coming from a Bay Area, largely popular city with high population, over 1 million people just into my city alone, to be able to go to an island and see something that is, their architecture is still kind of a throwback to older buildings. And just to be able to preserve that and see that, that's I'd go just to enjoy the seashore, the cattle, the cows running around, just so much space that isn't industrialized is an enjoyment for me.
I fell in love personally with getting to walk around like the Finlagen and getting to walk around like Kildalton as well. And those areas like that, those are public lands. Like that takes investment to be able to upkeep, and that is some of the history, some of the oldest history that Scotland actually has to be able to draw on as well. So that to me was part of the magic of Islay is the vibration that you feel kind of emanating through the ground, that sense of place, that importance of the sense of place that you feel whenever you're on that island is there's a high that kind of comes along with it.
Yep. When Cam and I had done one of these episodes on peat in particular, and as long as you're talking about the sense of place and the ground you walk on, there is no more direct representation on the palate than peat, and peat is an encapsulation of the history of the place that you're looking at. If you're standing in the peat bogs in the Mockery, You're standing on thousands of years of decaying, rich history of the island itself. The underlying geology, the granite-based underlying geology. That's one thing. But peat captures time in this sort of fixed but malleable and useful source, not just for fuel, and flavor, but the flavor of place comes from the ground underneath you to a degree, and that's one of the things that I absolutely love about Islay whiskeys, is that you capture not just the distiller's art, but thousands of years of geologic history in the experience of that whiskey, which I just think adds to the magic of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. History, but in like in a way that you can taste, in a way that you can experience. That's incredible.
Yep. Yeah, you have to have a chance. You have to go and try to dig a few sections of peat out just to see the hard work that it takes them every time they dig.
Oh yeah. I was holding some up. I don't know if the lens is capturing it, but a little bit of peat from Islay as well that I keep around. That is not easy work at all.
No.
Dan, you mentioned
spade is something else.
You mentioned that Ardbeg is coming online here as well, and that's a very iconic and historical. Peat Bog as well is named after that site. Any update that you have, either Tim or Dan, on the situation with Ardbeg going online and Port Ellen also coming back as a featured distillery on Islay?
Tim, I'm going to defer to you on that. I've heard nothing about Ardbeg recently.
Yeah, I haven't, because of the differing rumors and stories of the past few years. I've decided just to wait until I see something there.
Yeah. And Port Ellen, I think, is on. Well, it's probably as on schedule as the Ardbeg renovation. Just COVID's probably taken it back a mile and a half. But who was it? The ex-distiller at Talisker is running the Port Ellen project now. I don't remember her name. I wish I did, but I don't remember her name. I'm drawing a blank.
It wasn't Georgie, was it?
Yeah. That's exactly who it is. Yep. Yeah. So she's behind the Port Ellen project. Mike could just set that up. So 2 years out from Spirit Flowing, Mike, I'm guessing is what you're saying. Because when we were at Port Ellen Maltings and Colin took us around that tour, the renovation work on the distillery side was in its infancy. It appeared to me to be 2020.
Yeah.
A long. Yeah. And it's like, nope.
Even
that's aggressive.
Then, we were like, no, that's not going to happen. Yeah.
Pre-COVID, that was aggressive.
Yeah.
So we'll see that. Yeah. To your point, we'll see it when we see it.
I remember that moment, like standing up on the roof at the Port Ellen malting facility, looking out over the backside at where Port Ellen, the distillery, is going.
Yeah.
Hearing Colin say like, "Oh yeah, it's gonna, they'll be done by 2020, end of 2020." Just being like, I don't think that's gonna happen. Like, yeah.
Right. Done digging it out from its own rubble, and you can still see the pagodas. It was weird from the malting facility, from the top of the malting facility, how it dwarfed the malting floor, what used to be the malting floor at Port Ellen. Those pagoda, the tops of the pagodas were many dozens of feet below the top of so it's not a big place. It'll be really interesting to see. Of course, you're not going to taste mature spirit from there for years and years and years anyway. So it'll be an interesting, and it's another one of those things that, to Diageo's credit, resurrecting Brewer and Port Ellen. It's not a profit model for tomorrow. By any means. So we'll see how that goes. Obviously we're out a solid bit past an hour, and we'd absolutely love to have you back on again, Tim, at some point. What you provide to the whiskey drinking public is an immense resource, to the point that Cam and I don't want to speak for you, Cam, but I know that I've relied on Ardbeg Project in countless ways to try to give people that send me questions about old expressions of Ardbeg, or even historical elements of Glenmorangie, I go, you're the first stop to try to answer those kinds of questions. So what you've built in the 15 years that you've been making the Ardbeg Project happen is a tremendous gift to whiskey drinkers everywhere. And I want to make sure that we vociferously thank you for the work that you've done and you continue to do on behalf of Ardbeg as a brand and on behalf of whiskey drinkers everywhere. So thank you for that. Thank you for being on the show today, obviously. Cam, I'm sure you've got some closing remarks that you want to make as well.
Absolutely. I just wanted to as well kind of echo and voice, my gratitude for you coming on today, and also for everything that you've done for a brand that not only I, but, there's hundreds of thousands of people around the world love, and get to view, the hard work that you've done with saving part of the history and some of the DNA, kind of being a living, kind of library for a lot of the history of not only the brand, but also the island as well. So for any, people who are watching that are not Ardbegians already, please go online, go to ardbeg.com and become Ardbegians by becoming committee members. But then if you're really serious about it, dive in deep on ardbegproject.com as well, because it's absolutely incredible, and I can get lost on that website for hours. So thank you very much for all that you've done for this brand.
You're welcome. You're both welcome. And it's, I always want to make sure none of this is possible without the work you guys do. So right back at you guys. Thank you for the promotion and everything you do for the brand and all the people behind the scenes that make it possible for me to collect information. So I'm glad
Cam, we've got an event coming in January that, in theory, will involve Colin Gordon in a virtual environment. So we'll make sure that when that's going to be, and it'd be cool to even just have you sort of residually involved as a viewer, but it'd be really, really cool to have you involved as a contributor as well. So we'll talk about that if and when the time comes.
Yeah.
In the meantime, thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of Highlands to Islands. Cam's show on Monday and Fridays is Whiskey Through Food. He just did if you missed the sardines episode yesterday, it was amazing. I'm dying to go try that, the combination that you put together. That's at 5 p.m. Eastern time. Tim's site, Ardbeg Project, www.ardbegproject.com. The single best archival resource for anything you want to know about Ardbeg that exists on the planet. We'll be here every Tuesday for Highlands to Islands at 5 p.m. Eastern, streaming on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Thanks, Tim. Thanks again so much. As always, my partner in crime, Ardbeg Cam. Thank you for all of the research and insights that you bring to these every week, but particularly to this one. And thanks everybody for joining us online, and those of you who watch in the future. Thanks again, and have a good Thanksgiving, everyone. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll speak again next week.
One other thing to jump in real quick. My site can be confusing. If you just want to look at those old websites, it's from the archives tab at the top.
Oh, perfect. That's great.
I actually have the Ardbeg site from 2000, the Lefroy website from 1997, and the Glenmorangie website from 1995. Actually, really officially the first in-depth whiskey website. Yeah, and it's digging into it. It's remarkable what we used to tell people. I'll shut up now so I don't get fired. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good set of holidays, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. All right, cheers.